Let me now move into some issues in Isaiah chapter 40 through 66, part of the book where future hope in the exile and beyond come to the fore. When you get to Isaiah 40, the mood of the book of Isaiah passes from dark judgment to the light of salvation. The theme is one of comfort. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice is calling in the wilderness, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. And as we've seen in our critical introduction, that the audience seems to be those in exile. They've gone into exile as Isaiah had predicted, and yet beyond that, God is going to comfort and come back to them. A little bit of a theological outline of this part of the book. Isaiah 40 through 48 emphasizes the greatness of God, God's power, God's holiness, God's wisdom, His justice, His providence in using kings and nations along the way, the fact that God is Redeemer and His ability to predict the future. That's 40 through 48. Roughly chapters 49 through 57, and you could break it up slightly differently if you wished. There's an emphasis on a figure known as the servant of Yahweh, or the servant of the Lord. And we're going to argue that this pertains to Messiah, though this would not have been clear to the original readers. But if the first section is theology proper, this section would be Christology. It'll emphasize the coming of the servant of the Lord, which we associate with King Messiah. And then the last part of the book will talk about the New Jerusalem, the end of all things, including a new Jerusalem and a new heaven and a new earth, and finally a judgment. The last few verses which talk about where the punishment will come upon people, where the worm will not die and the fire will not be quenched, is quoted by Jesus as applicable of hell. And that arguably is exactly what Isaiah is talking about. And so there's theology proper, there's Christology, and then there's eschatology in this part of the book. Now, among the themes in Isaiah, as we saw, are the greatness of God. In Isaiah 40, it talks about how God is able to save them from the Babylonian exile. In those verses that we saw in Isaiah 44 and Isaiah 45, it predicts that God would raise up Cyrus, who would allow them to return from Babylonian exile. Isaiah 46 through 48 predicts judgment on and the fall of Babylon, which would put an end to the Babylonian exile. We also see the theme of God as Redeemer in chapters 40 through 48. Very often it uses that expression. This is what the Lord says, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. And the term Redeemer is the Hebrew word goel, which is also used in the book of Ruth as a kinsman redeemer, someone who works on behalf of a relative. And so God treats Israel as if they were a relative to whom God feels the obligation to help out of their troubles and servitude. So God is Israel's Redeemer. That's another theme. Yet another theme in chapter 40 through 48 is the new Exodus. The old Exodus was the Exodus from Egypt. The new Exodus is going to be Exodus from Babylonia. And passages like Isaiah 40, verse 4, when it speaks of how God would come and gather them and redeem them, emphasizes that new Exodus theme. And Cyrus is going to be the means of initiating that new Exodus. But in this part of the book, the new Exodus is announced, but it's not going to be completely fulfilled until the coming of the servant of the Lord. And that brings us to the servant songs in the book of Isaiah. There are four passages that were identified in a commentary by a 19th century scholar named Doom, who wrote his commentary on Isaiah in 1892. He identified four passages that he called servant songs. Now, I might add Isaiah 61 to that list, but we'll just tell you what Doom had to say. Doom, by the way, is the same person who first proposed the idea of Trito-Isaiah. The idea of Deutero-Isaiah had already existed, but he broke up chapters 40 through 66 into two sections, one by Deutero-Isaiah and another by Trito-Isaiah. He was the first one to propose that, which became very popular in critical circles. But in terms of the servant passages, he identified four passages which he called servant songs in the book. And this observation has been widely repeated. The question that rises from this, though, is who is the servant of the servant songs? And there have been a number of proposals as to the identity. The traditional view identifies the servant in these passages as King Messiah, especially Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. The common Jewish view, and this would be also common among critical scholars, is that the servant of the Lord, or the servant of Yahweh, is Israel. Another critical view, and Wybray would be a defender of this, is that the servant of the Lord is the prophet himself, the prophet being Deutero-Isaiah, again assuming the critical view of Isaiah, that it would be Deutero-Isaiah. And those are the three most common views that are out there today. Historically, there's been some other ones. Occasionally people will say that the servant of the Lord is Cyrus and his successor Darius. In the history of interpretation, others like Hezekiah and Josiah have been suggested. But these three views are the most common views of the identity of the servant in these servant passages. So what I want to do is to look at the servant of the Lord in these passages, at least to the original readers, this mysterious servant who appears to be righteous, who is a light to the nations, who will suffer for the sins of his people and bring about the full deliverance. Now, in this part of Isaiah, before we get to the particulars of the servant songs, we're going to learn that the new Exodus is going to be postponed until this servant of the Lord appears, and that the old covenant would be restored under a new and everlasting covenant under a new David. That's the passage in Isaiah 55. In Isaiah 55, 3 through 5, it says, "Give ear and come to me, listen that you may live. I," God is speaking, will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promise to David. I have made him, David, a witness to the peoples, a ruler and a commander of the peoples. Surely you will summon nations you do not know, and nations who you do not know will come running to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has endowed you with splendor. So there's going to be a new covenant here called an everlasting covenant under a new David. Of course, by Isaiah's day, the historical David had long since died, but there's going to be a new David. So that ultimately, as the previous chapter talks about, Zion would go from shame to glory. Well, let's look at one of those servant passages and raise the question as to the identity of the servant. But we need to do that in the next video.